Our first question is from a listener named Logan, and they asked, "My hamstrings constantly feel tight. Any advice with that?"
Logan, thank you for that question. And it makes me think of our friend from Louisiana because
Mm-hmm.
she's a phenomenal performing artist, incredible dancer.
Mm-hmm.
Had a little bit of a dance off at the previous wedding, but
Yeah.
we need to recycle that and redo that. But the reason I say that is because I've worked with rugby, hockey, football, like all these sports where you need really strong hamstrings in order to be able to perform because the number one injury in those sports is a hamstring tear. Hockey tends to be the groin, but the groin and hamstring are very interconnected. But I've also worked with performing artists on tour. I think Annie, Anastasia, I think those are the main ones. I might be missing one, but I got to work with these artists backstage and so appreciated what they do and the performance that they deliver because I had no idea what they go through. Their prep is crazy. Like they do not just show up to the theater at 6 p.m., get ready, and then put on the show at 7 p.m. They're in 10 to 12-hour rehearsals, and then they're doing the show. They're not getting to bed till 1 in the morning. They're waking up, doing that again, going to sleep, waking up, doing that again, 5, 6 days in a row, hopping on the tour bus, going to the next city, and recycling, redoing all of it. And when they're rehearsing, most of the time they're in full costume, full uniform to do the things that they're doing. So absolutely mind blown with their work ethic and the cool thing I got to connect with one of the actors and ask him, why do you do this? Because it's a lot. It's a lot to put in. And he goes, when I was at my worst, when I felt like there was nothing left, I went to a play. I went to a theater by myself. And it was the first time I felt joy. And it changed me. And if I can do that for somebody else, if I can do that for one other person, it's completely worth it. And I'm counting down the days until he's on Broadway because that mission, his vision, his work ethic, his why is just so incredible. But anyway, these performing artists, one of the number one things that they come back with is that my hamstrings feel tight. You do a test for the hamstring length, their knee is touching their forehead. that is not a tight hamstring. The perception is that it feels tight, but from the flexibility test, we see that it's not tight. In most cases, what we see is that the hamstring itself is not actually tight. There's something else going on. That something else, we'd have to test it out and kind of tease it out, but I'll break it down into a couple different domains. One is nerve tension. The hamstring, all these muscles on the posterior thigh, the sciatic nerve from the back going all the way down to the bottom of the foot, it runs through there. If our internal load is high, welcome to the performing arts community. They have some of the highest internal load. It's the only activity, I mean, figure skating, I think it would fit in there, but you have to be perfect. And if you're not perfect, that affects the play, it affects the score, it affects all those things. In football, you make a mistake, not everybody notices it right away. You trip on stage, everybody notices it. So their internal load is elevated. Constant chase of perfection, constant judgment, nutritional habits, like all these things, they have high internal load. So now their nervous system is feeling a threat, it's creating tension, so it's making these areas feel tight. So instead of doing hamstring stretching, what we do is nerve gliding, which we talked about on a previous episode. So that nerve gliding goes a long way to alleviate the perception of tightness of the hamstring. So that's kind of one bucket, is it's probably more nerve tension. And if there's internal load that's elevated, it's even more likely that it's nerve tension. Let's slide that nerve back and forth. Some of these artists, what we do for their half-hour session is they lay on the table and they breathe. They just put their hands on their belly. They take deep breaths in through their nose, out through their nose. And I encourage them for that time. They get up and they're like, what was that? I haven't felt like this in years. And I was like, you took the moment to be a person, not a performing artist, but a person. And that goes such a long way. So that's the one bucket. Look at your internal load. If there's nerve tension, is the nerve tension due to true nerve tension, or is a nerve under tension because of internal load? And cycling back to a previous episode when we were talking about plantar fasciitis, that's another thing to look at, because it's not just the hamstring, but to the bottom of the foot, it could be the internal load that's bringing on those symptoms. So the next thing is it could be that what tends to happen, and especially people that are explosive, people that think of like your 100-meter sprinter, your defensive back, your wide receiver in football, your wings in hockey, these people that they make a living off of how explosive they are. What tends to happen is that their hips rotate kind of forward into this anterior pelvic tilt. If you don't know what anterior pelvic tilt is, think of like sticking your butt out, like kind of the booty pics you see on Instagram. If you're following those, probably shouldn't be following those, but just know that that's what an anterior pelvic tilt is. When you're in an anterior pelvic tilt, your hamstring is attached to the ischial tuberosity, which is your sit bone. If you're in this pelvic tilt, your sit bone is now higher than it would be if you're in a neutral pelvic position or a posterior pelvic tilt. So posterior pelvic tilt, then if anterior pelvic tilt elongates the hamstrings, posterior pelvic tilt then minimizes the length that the hamstring has to go. So what we tend to see in these explosive athletes is that they're super far tilted. Their hamstrings feel tight, but they feel tight because they're already at their max length. So they don't need more hamstring stretching. They need hamstring strengthening and likely some lower ab strengthening to help bring that pelvis out of that huge anterior pelvic tilt and get them back into that other position. At the same time, that position is what makes them successful with explosiveness. So we then have to ask the question of, I know your hamstrings feel tight, but it's honestly worth it because that's what is making you explosive. And if we change that, then are we going to change your explosiveness? In the off season, let's play around with that. During the season, I don't want to be messing around with that, right? So there's a lot that goes into it. It tends to be, is it neural tension? Do you need to change your pelvic position? And then the third bucket would be, does the hamstring actually need to be strengthened? Because weaker muscles, they tend to feel tighter than stronger muscles. So we need to eccentrically strengthen it, which means lengthening it to strengthen it. So thinking of like RDL, where you're keeping your legs straight, you're hinging at your hips, leaning down, you're lengthening the hamstring as you're strengthening it. So you have to figure out which bucket do you fit in of those three. Sometimes it's a combo of all three of those. Sometimes it's one versus the other one. But what I would say is if you continuously keep stretching your hamstring and it still feels tight, well, we need to look at it differently.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And listeners, maybe you have to do some assessments to figure out which of those three buckets you fit in. You might have to reflect on your life and what's going on and figure out the internal load. You might have to look and see, which bucket do I fit in?